Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Critics and Debates of Ecocriticism in Discourse Analysis. Ecocriticism within discourse analysis scrutinizes how language and literary texts influence perceptions of environmental issues. Key debates revolve around anthropocentrism, eco-centrism, and greenwashing. Critics delve into how these perspectives shape environmental discourse, exploring their ethical implications and societal impacts. 1. Anthropocentrism. Ecocriticism in discourse analysis focuses on how language and literary texts shape our understanding of nature and environmental issues. When examining anthropocentrism, critics emphasize how human-centric perspectives dominate and influence how we perceive environmental issues. 1. Critiques of anthropocentrism in language. Hierarchical structuring. Language often reflects an anthropocentric worldview, portraying humans as the most significant entity. This hierarchy implies that nature's purpose is to serve humanity, reinforcing environmental exploitation. Devaluation of nature. Anthropocentric language tends to depict nature as a resource, disregarding its intrinsic value. For example, using terms like natural resources implies that nature exists primarily for human benefit. Metaphors and symbols. Common metaphors and symbols rooted in anthropocentrism convey human superiority over nature. For instance, describing a forest as a wilderness to be tamed shapes our perception of nature as something to be controlled. 2. Debates in ecocriticism. Biocentrism versus anthropocentrism. A central debate is between biocentric views, where all life forms have intrinsic value, and anthropocentrism. Critics argue that biocentrism promotes a more egalitarian view of nature, influencing language to value non-human entities more highly. Ethical implications. Critics debate the ethical implications of anthropocentric discourse, considering how it impacts policy and public perception. Anthropocentrism in language may indirectly justify environmental degradation through a human-centered ethical framework. Cultural and regional differences. The influence of anthropocentrism in language varies across cultures and regions, leading to debates about its universality. Critics argue that some cultures inherently integrate a more holistic view of nature, influencing their discourse. 3. Challenges in addressing anthropocentrism. Deep-seated norms. Anthropocentrism is deeply ingrained in many languages and cultures, making it challenging to alter entrenched linguistic norms. Pragmatic limitations. Efforts to remove anthropocentrism from language sometimes clash with practical communication needs, where human-centric references are easier to understand. Interdisciplinary nature. Addressing anthropocentrism in discourse requires interdisciplinary approaches, combining linguistics, philosophy, and environmental science, complicating the formation of comprehensive critiques. In summary, ecocriticism in discourse analysis critically examines anthropocentric language that prioritizes human needs over environmental health. This analysis is vital to understanding how language shapes our relationship with the environment and to advocating for more inclusive, biocentric perspectives. 2. Ecocentrism. Ecocentrism in discourse analysis seeks to challenge anthropocentric narratives, advocating for language that emphasizes ecological concerns. This approach strives to represent nature's intrinsic value and foster more sustainable relationships between humans and the environment. 1. Advocating eco-centric language. Redefining values. Eco-centric discourse advocates for a shift from viewing nature as a resource to valuing its intrinsic worth. This involves redefining terms that typically signify exploitation to ones that imply stewardship and interconnectedness. Ecological narratives. Eco-centric discourse often highlights interconnected ecosystems and the interdependence between humans and non-human entities, emphasizing the importance of biodiversity and ecosystem health. Empathy and engagement. Language is crafted to evoke empathy for nature and foster a sense of stewardship. Descriptions emphasize nature's beauty, complexity, and the ethical implications of environmental harm. 2. Debates surrounding eco-centrism. Feasibility and implementation. Critics debate the practicality of implementing eco-centric discourse in real-world scenarios. There's concern that abstract ideals might not translate into actionable language policies. Cultural and linguistic diversity. Applying a universal eco-centric discourse is debated due to diverse cultural and linguistic interpretations of nature. What may resonate in one culture might not in another, complicating global adoption. Economic and social tensions. Eco-centric discourse often conflicts with economic interests, particularly in regions reliant on industries like mining, agriculture, or logging. Critics argue that balancing environmental concerns with economic needs remains a significant challenge. 3. Critiques of eco-centric discourse. Idealism versus pragmatism. Some critics argue that eco-centrism is too idealistic, potentially alienating those who prioritize economic stability. They contend that such discourse could be too radical for mainstream adoption. Simplification of issues. Eco-centric discourse can oversimplify complex environmental issues, reducing them to binary opposites. Critics emphasize the need to recognize the nuanced interplay of ecological, economic, and social factors. Political instrumentalization. There's concern that eco-centric language can be appropriated for political agendas, sometimes used to justify policies that may not actually prioritize environmental health. 4. Challenges in promoting eco-centrism. Changing narratives. Shifting from anthropocentric to eco-centric language involves challenging deeply ingrained societal narratives, which is a slow and often resisted process. Educational and media influence. Eco-centric discourse requires support from educational institutions and media to gain widespread acceptance. However, their influence varies across regions and cultures. Policy and practice gaps. Bridging the gap between eco-centric discourse and actionable policy remains challenging due to conflicting interests and political complexities. In summary, eco-centrism advocates for discourse that places ecological concerns at the forefront, challenging anthropocentric narratives. It faces debates over practicality, cultural diversity, and political instrumentalization, and its implementation requires overcoming significant societal, economic, and political challenges. 3. Greenwashing. Greenwashing in discourse analysis critically examines how language is used to create a false impression of environmental responsibility in policies, products, and practices. This form of deceptive communication often obscures the actual environmental impact, misleading the public and complicating genuine sustainability efforts. 1. Critiques of greenwashing in language. Ambiguous terminology. Greenwashing often employs vague terms like eco-friendly, natural, or sustainable, without providing concrete evidence or definitions, allowing companies to project an environmentally conscious image without significant changes. Selective disclosure. Companies engaging in greenwashing highlight their positive environmental actions while omitting or downplaying negative impacts. This selective disclosure creates a skewed perception of their overall sustainability. Visual deception. Greenwashing frequently uses imagery that evokes nature and sustainability, e.g., green leaves, clean water, to give a false impression of eco-friendliness, regardless of the actual environmental impact of the product or policy. 2. Debates on greenwashing in discourse analysis. Ethical implications. There is debate over the ethical responsibilities of businesses in communication. Critics argue that greenwashing undermines trust and hinders meaningful progress toward sustainability, while some defend it as strategic marketing. Consumer confusion. Greenwashing creates confusion among consumers, making it difficult to distinguish genuinely sustainable products from deceptive ones. The debate centers around how to educate consumers effectively and regulate misleading claims. Impact on policy and regulation. Greenwashing affects environmental policy by influencing public opinion and policymakers. Critics argue that stronger regulations are needed to prevent greenwashing, while others believe existing guidelines suffice. 3. Forms of greenwashing. Tokenism. Companies may implement superficial green initiatives, such as small donations to environmental causes, to appear sustainable without addressing significant environmental issues in their operations. Misleading labels. Labels and certifications can be manipulated to suggest environmental benefits that don't exist. Some companies create their own certification schemes with lax criteria to give an illusion of independent validation. Irrelevant claims. Companies sometimes highlight environmentally friendly aspects of their products that have little impact, such as stating a product is CFC-free when CFCs have been banned for decades. 4. Addressing greenwashing. Regulation and oversight. Governments and regulatory bodies need to enforce stricter guidelines and penalties for deceptive environmental claims to hold companies accountable. Consumer education. Educating consumers about greenwashing tactics can empower them to make informed decisions and scrutinize environmental claims more critically. Third-party certifications. Independent third-party certifications with stringent criteria provide a more reliable measure of sustainability, helping consumers trust genuinely sustainable products. In summary, greenwashing in discourse analysis critically examines how language is manipulated to obscure the true environmental impact of policies and practices. This deception can undermine genuine sustainability efforts, making it crucial to address greenwashing through better regulation, education, and certification practices. Conclusion. The examination of anthropocentrism highlights how human-centric language affects environmental perceptions and justifies exploitation. In contrast, eco-centrism advocates for language that underscores the intrinsic value of nature, challenging anthropocentric norms but facing practical implementation challenges. Greenwashing, with its deceptive language and imagery, further complicates sustainability efforts, necessitating enhanced regulation and consumer awareness. Together, these critiques illuminate the crucial role of discourse in shaping environmental attitudes and policies. Frequently asked questions. What is anthropocentrism, and how does it influence environmental discourse? Anthropocentrism is a human-centric worldview that influences environmental discourse by portraying humans as the most significant entity and nature as a resource to serve humanity. It often leads to hierarchical language and metaphors that devalue nature's intrinsic worth. What are the main critiques of anthropocentrism in language? Critiques focus on hierarchical structuring that places humans above nature, the devaluation of nature by viewing it as a resource, and the use of metaphors that reinforce human dominance over nature, like depicting forests as wilderness to be tamed. How do biocentric and anthropocentric perspectives differ in discourse analysis? Biocentrism emphasizes the intrinsic value of all life forms and advocates for an egalitarian view of nature in language. In contrast, anthropocentrism prioritizes human needs and often justifies environmental exploitation through a human-centered ethical framework. What are the challenges in addressing anthropocentrism in discourse analysis? Challenges include altering deeply ingrained anthropocentric norms in language, balancing pragmatic communication needs, and the interdisciplinary nature of the issue, requiring insights from linguistics, philosophy, and environmental science. What is ecocentrism, and how does it differ from anthropocentrism? Ecocentrism is a perspective that emphasizes ecological concerns over human-centered views. It advocates for language that represents nature's intrinsic value, fosters sustainable relationships, and promotes empathy for the environment. What are the debates surrounding ecocentric discourse? Debates focus on the feasibility of implementing ecocentric language, cultural and linguistic diversity in its interpretation, and the tension between environmental concerns and economic interests in regions dependent on industries like mining and agriculture. What criticisms do ecocentric perspectives face in discourse analysis? Critics argue that ecocentrism can be too idealistic, oversimplify complex environmental issues, and be appropriated for political agendas that do not genuinely prioritize environmental health. How is greenwashing defined in discourse analysis, and why is it problematic? Greenwashing is the deceptive use of language to create a false impression of environmental responsibility. It can mislead the public about the true environmental impact of policies and practices, undermining genuine sustainability efforts. What are the common forms of greenwashing in language? Common forms include tokenism, misleading labels and certifications, and irrelevant claims that emphasize environmentally friendly aspects with minimal actual impact. How can greenwashing be addressed effectively? Addressing greenwashing requires stricter regulation and oversight of environmental claims, educating consumers about deceptive practices, and promoting independent third-party certifications that offer more reliable sustainability measures.